Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about 10 books that I really like but I think are very difficult to recommend. So this video is basically kind of a disguised way for me to recommend them to you, but kind of with a big warning label on them. They have these warning labels on them for a variety of different reasons that I'll talk about as we get to the books. So let's go ahead and talk about the first book, which is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. Now, the warning for this book is I think a lot of people are going to read this and think it is one of the most boring books they have ever read. They're not going to connect with it. They're going to think that it's just really boring. And I totally get that because it almost kind of is. But to me, this is one of the most compelling books I've ever read. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I absolutely love it. I think part of it is I do absolutely love Hemingway's writing. It's very sparse and it doesn't like have all that. It's not purple. That's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot. And to me, it's like the opposite of that. It's just frank almost, but it has this like slightly, it has this flow to it at the same time. But once again, this is a book where I think so many people are going to look at it and read it and just be like, why do I care? Why do I care about this old man in the sea? And I totally get that. But for me, it is definitely one that I think is worth at least giving a chance, if not for the fact that it is very short. And I always have an easier time recommending a book that is short. Obviously, this is one that a lot of people do like, but I have found that when I recommend it to people recently, I don't get the best reaction from it. And once again, I think it's mostly because people are going to read it and just think it's boring. And for whatever reason, I don't know if it's because I like fishing. And I can understand the struggle and this not giving up attitude that happens throughout the book. But, there are people whose opinion I really, really respect, and they do not like this book, which is fine. You don't have to like anything that I like. But for me, this is a top-notch book, but comes with that warning label of it might be really boring. Next up is The Jungle by Upton St. Clair. And I know a lot of people are going to be like, you mean the book that people read and they changed the meatpacking industry? And yes, that is what the textbook told me too in like middle school American history or whatever it was. But this book is so much more than that. This book is really the struggle and shows the struggle of immigration during the time and the horrific things that happened, the things that people took advantage of these poor people and just kicked them again and again while they were down. And I will say this can be a hard book to recommend because the latter part of it really does become like a political essay, and that's going to turn a lot of people off. It is very heavily into socialism, and the end of it is basically like a big, it's hard to say it's not propaganda is maybe a strong word, but it is a sales pitch for hardcore socialism and how it's going to happen and how it's going to fix everything. The other hard thing that it makes this book to recommend is that a lot of horrible things do happen, and I just know a lot of people who don't want to read awful things happening over and over again. But I really think this is a book that if you read it, it makes you feel humanity again. It makes you want to help other people. It makes you want to be a better person. Maybe that sounds a little dramatic, but that is kind of what I felt after reading this book, even with the latter half of it really turning into like a very heavy political statement, which to me, it didn't matter. The other parts of this book were just so impactful that honestly, that stuff didn't even matter because the stuff that Yorgos goes through here in the meatpacking industry and just everything he goes through, and it just shows how like society whittled these people down and everything. And it's a super impactful book for me. Next up, and this is a little bit cheating because I'm technically not recommending 14 books, and that is the Ian Fleming James Bond books. Now, I have a whole video about which ones you should read and which ones you shouldn't. But in general, I do have a hard time recommending these books because they are very much a product of their time and their author. Ian Fleming was a successful, I don't actually know how successful he was before writing this, but it was an Englishman who served in World War II. And so the time and the prejudices that he had are very much on the page. They are very much influenced there. There's all kinds of derogatory terms towards women and other minorities, pretty much all of the stereotypical things that you can think of. They're in this book. And even with all of that, if you can get by that, I think there are some really fun spy tales in here. They are creative and just kind of like a good time. And I do struggle with my enjoyment of these and some of those things that are going on in the book because they're not things that I agree with. They're not things that I particularly like to read in my stories. And yet somehow I really liked so many of those books. They were just such a good time. And I don't know if that was just my ability to kind of turn that stuff and be like, well, I don't actually believe any of that. None of that really matters. In some of the books, it is more heavily implied, or not even implied, just stated in those books. And others, it's less so. So it's kind of a mixed bag there. I'll link my James Bond, which ones you should read video, so you can kind of maybe see more of my recommendations there. But that is what makes reading James Bond hard. It's all of those stereotypical things that you would expect from a spy thriller from a British gentleman written post-World War II. Next up is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. I always want to say William Defoe, but that's the actor, definitely not right. But Robinson Crusoe is another one of those books that I think a lot of people will find boring. It's obviously a much older book. Was this 1862 this came out? So there are definitely some like stereotypes again with like indigenous people again in this book where they're cannibals. But outside of that, it's just the struggle and letters of somebody, shipwrecked. And for whatever reason, it is written in a very specific style because it is older. But this is just another one of those books that for me was riveting. And I think for a lot of people, they're going to be like, okay, he's been stuck on this island for 30 years or whatever. How much, he's the same thing over and over again. And yet for whatever reason, I found it to be very compelling. Once again, totally get why a lot of people wouldn't like it. But this is another one that I do have a hard time recommending, partially because of the writing style, partially because of those stereotypes and those unsavory kind of thoughts and things that get put into this book. But if you want to read a tale of somebody stranded on an island and their will to survive and how they did it, and literally there's a section of this book where he just talks about how he planted bushes in a specific way to make a fence to keep goats in. It's like, for most people, that's not going to be an interesting, good time. But for me, for whatever reason, I don't know if I put myself in the character's shoes and thought about how I would survive on this island, the things that I would do. I don't know if that's what it was, or it's just that sense of adventure in me of, hallucinating that I would want to be stranded on a deserted island by myself or something like that. But it is a book that I did just have such a fantastic time with. Next up is a more modern book, and it actually has a very popular, I think it was a pretty popular adaptation, and that is American Psycho. This is a very difficult book and one that I struggle with recommending because of the grotesque violence in it. There is violence against animals and women and just some really gruesome stuff that Patrick Bateman, it's up for debate what if he does it or if he thinks it or what. But that it was difficult to read at times. There are definitely, especially, I was going to say especially the animal stuff, but especially the stuff to women that he does, it is very difficult. I do think there are some interesting discussions to be had with a book like this. Where is this glorifying violence? Is it saying that this kind of violence is okay? I don't think that. There's some other interesting discourse about the psychology of somebody in that kind of situation. There's all kinds of interesting things, but this isn't a book when somebody comes to me, I can easily recommend to them because of those things that happen in it. It's very difficult. I know that I think this won a lot of awards, and obviously there's a lot of discussions around it, but while I did like it, there's a lot of material in it that is just not okay, really, and it is a difficult read for that reason. I will say, I do think it is an easy book to read. It's not written in a way like some of the other things that I mentioned, like we were just talking about Robinson Crusoe, that has like more of an archaic way of reading because of the language it was used. That's not the case here with American Psycho. It's a much more modern book that you can kind of just read and experience in a modern way. But yeah, it does not hold back. And it goes into very graphic, gory detail. If you're somebody who likes, I'm trying to think, is it Hostel? I think was maybe one of those movies kind of post-Saw where it was very grotesque and gory and that kind of, if that's the kind of movie you like, this might be the kind of book for you. But if I'm trying to make a good comparison of something to it, there's another movie where they get like lost in a cave and it's very gory and gruesome and stuff. That's kind of what this book is like, but I don't know. It just felt so real and in a different way than some of those like cheesy B-level horror movies feel. That makes it a difficult book to say anybody should read. Next up is Snow Country, and the basic premise of this book is it's a man going and visiting a prostitute in Japan and kind of their relationship throughout the years and how it goes. This is a book that to me reminded me very much of Hemingway and the way it was written and kind of the way the story is. So if Hemingway isn't a writer who has clicked with you in the past, this is probably not one that is going to click with you as well. That is part of why I do find it difficult to recommend. And also, again, the plot and the story, it's kind of meandering. It's not something that I would recommend to a lot of people because it's, once again, kind of boring. You're just kind of in the life of these people and you're kind of experiencing their struggles and this back and forth that they're having. And while I do think it is a very beautiful book and very beautifully written, that's not what a lot of people are looking for. And there are just going to be people who look at the plot dealing with a prostitute and they're just going to be out right from that aspect of it. So this is another one of those books where I think it's kind of takes an advanced reader to actually sit down and read it and enjoy it in the way that I think it's meant to be enjoyed. Next up is a science fiction book that I actually just recently read this year, and that is A Time of Change changes. Now, this is a difficult book to read, one, because of the writing style. This is a book where the word I is not used, but when it is used, it is very impactful. The world that this is taking place on, the individual, the self, is seen as an obscure thing. It's not obscure, obscene thing is the word I'm looking for there. It's not good. You're not supposed to be an individual. You're a part of the collective group and everything from there. So that kind of makes it a little bit hard. And then there is later on in this book the only way to really describe it is LSD trips, where our character is like mind melding with other, like taking drugs and mind melding with people, and there's this like weird LSD trippy stuff that goes on to it. And so I think that does make it very difficult to recommend for that point. Once again, there are definitely some very interesting descriptions of the male characters themselves. Our male character talks about his member way more often than I needed at any point in any book ever, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. So that is another one that it's just a little hard to recommend for those reasons. Now, I will say, I think this is a very impactful book. I think it asks some really interesting questions about the idea of being an individual or a part of a collective group and all those kinds of things. But man, some of those other things, I know a lot of people who with modern sensibilities are going to look at this and just be like, why am I reading this? This is too weird, this is too out there, and it's not for them. Next up, I'm actually going to do a 2-for-1 here because they're both from probably my favorite author, Session Liu, and that is The Cretaceous Past and Supernova Era. So Supernova Era is hard to recommend, and they're actually both hard to recommend because the ideas are just so far out there and the characters are lacking severely here. I know that is a problem that people mention with the Three-Body Problem, that trilogy all the time, that the characters are not really all that and everything, and that is very much true here for these next two books. But the Supernova Era, the basic premise is that a supernova happens 12-ish million light years away or something like that, and those gamma rays hit Earth, and everybody over the age of 13 is going to die. And we end up exploring the world and society of how it would be if it was run by children who were influenced by adults at some point. This book has some commentary on nuclear warfare, war in general. It has some very has some very heavy stereotypes about certain regions and cultures of people. It's out there. America turned into like a gun wasteland. There's all kinds of weird things. The way that kids look at war is explored, and just it's very interesting. And like I said, with the characters, there's not a character's name that I remember from this book, right? I remember ideas that characters were representing, but their actual names weren't important. Like, you don't need to know a character's name to understand the points that are happening in this book because they're so represented by ideas. The other book, The Cretaceous Past, is maybe even more ambitious of an idea. The basic idea is that life has been on the planet for millions of years, millions and millions of years. The idea that humanity is the only intelligent, sentient species that has evolved is probably not true. And so Session Liu takes us back to the Cretaceous period and has ants and dinosaurs be intelligent beings that end up working together to form society. And that basically starts out by a dinosaur lays down in front of an ant's nest and they eat the meat out of its teeth that is making him uncomfortable. From there, that leads to ants exploring dinosaurs' bodies to produce medicine, and that progresses more and more to basically the point that there are dinosaur and ant societies throughout the planet. And I think at one point they even like create space flight, right? So that's like the basic idea. And that is really hard for a lot of people to like sit down and take seriously in a meaningful way. Personally, I had a really great time with it, but I can see why a lot of people would not, because it is kind of an out there idea. And once again, characters completely irrelevant in this book. I don't even know if there's characters' names. There's a few, but it's so irrelevant to the idea because the idea is basically just dinosaurs and ants making society. It is very interesting, but once again, hard to recommend. And the last book I'm going to mention here is one that I actually just recently read, and that is Jerusalem Fire. This is a really interesting book that I think a lot of people would find boring, and it's meandering, and before it gets to the point of what it's actually really trying to tell you, it takes like half the book to do it. It's very strange. This book really ends up being a idea of forgiveness, war, atrocities, othering other people and species, and like acceptance of those people and things. But the first half of this book is really like exploring an alien planet, getting to know a new culture and all of these things. The writing is a little archaic, and I think a lot of people would struggle with it. But I do think it asks some really important questions, has a lot more to offer than just the words on the page. I think it's one of those books when you think back to it and really think about it, you could have a good discussion on some of the ideas and things that it is talking about in that book. But that is my list. Let me know if after hearing this that you plan on reading any of these. I would love to know if you have or are going to now after this with their caution flags, as I would say. But that is all for me, and as always, have a good one.